The aftermath of World War II was not merely the story of victory. It was a vast, unplanned, and deeply human struggle to manage unprecedented displacement and suffering. Official Allied planning, while present, was often based on outdated assumptions and failed to grasp the unique nature of the Holocaust. This crucial conceptual gap meant that a humanitarian effort, designed for Generai survivors, the consequences for international policy, and for the creation of new nations, would prove profound and lasting. Even before the war's conclusion, Nazi Germany's war machine was critically dependent on a vast, coerced foreign labor force. This necessity created immense logistical, ideological, and social tensions within the Reich, ultimately impacting its capacity to sustain the war effort and contributing directly to atrocities. The pre-war rearmament and the onset of hostilities created a severe deficit in German labor, particular to atrocities. A core Nazi strategy was to prevent civilian privation and maintain morale by shielding the German population from war's direct impact. This necessitated the systematic use of foreign labor to maintain production and food supply. The brutality of this system was immediate and comprehensive. In the spring of 1940, a young art student named Anna, working as a nurse in a Krakow hospital, experienced this firsthand. Gestapo officers arrived, rounding up her and her colleagues, forcing them onto trains bound for Germany. By October of 1940, trains arrived daily from Poland, each carrying 1,000 workers into forced servitude. This marked the beginning of a systematic and increasingly forceful acquisition of foreign labor. The invasion of the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941, expected to be brief, fundamentally altered Germany's manpower needs. It created a problematic new pool of potential labor in the form of Russian prisoners of war. By the end of that campaign, 3.3 million Russian prisoners had been captured, with over half perishing due to deliberate starvation and neglect. This systematic exploitation was characterized by systemic mistreatment, inferior living conditions, and brutal enforcement, including summary executions for minor infractions. Polish workers, for instance, were forced to live apart in separate barracks, wear an identity tag with P, accept inferior wages, and face death penalties for sexual contact with Germans. The pragmatic need for labor directly conflicted with Nazi racial ideology. Historian Ulrich Herbert highlights this conflict, noting the creation of apartheid-like systems and severe penalties for perceived racial transgressions. By April 1942, a severe food crisis impacted both German civilians and foreign workers. This forced a significant shift in food distribution policy, with devastating consequences for targeted groups. Walther Darrer, the ideologically driven Minister of Food and Agriculture, was replaced by Herbert Back, a proponent of the Hunger Plan. Back's policies prioritized German food security by living off conquered lands and deliberately starving certain populations. This food crisis and the systematic dehumanization of groups like Jews and Poles likely accelerated the final solution, as starvation became a tool of extermination. Despite the immense suffering, the foreign labor program was instrumental in maintaining and even increasing German industrial production, reaching its peak in 1944. By autumn of that year, some 2.8 million Soviet citizens were working in Germany, nearly half deported after Stalingrad. In total, by summer 1944, about a quarter of Germany's workforce was foreign. 7.8 million people. This included 5.7 million civilian workers and 2 million prisoners of war. The Allies, meanwhile, were attempting to prepare for the inevitable collapse. The desire to avoid the humanitarian catastrophes of World War I, where civilian deaths from starvation and disease far outstripped battlefield casualties, led to the creation of new international relief organizations. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, haunted by the failures of the League of Nations, envisioned a new international order. He focused on the four policemen: the United States, the Soviet Union, Britain, and China as the core of a new security organization. By early 1943, preparations for post-war relief intensified. The four wise men, Dean Acheson for the US, Lord Halifax for Britain, Maxim Litvinov for the Soviet Union, and Wei Taoming for China, negotiated the draft agreement for an international relief agency. On November 9, 1943, the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, UNR, was formally established. It was a bold, unprecedented attempt at international cooperation. However, Allied planners in the early to mid-war period were far more aware of mass labor displacement than the systematic extermination of Jews. This led to the dominant concept of displaced persons, a term that encompassed both inmates of Bergen-Belsen and Jewish patients in Pittsburgh. The lack of a readily understood Holocaust concept meant victims were categorized and treated as general displaced persons. This would prove a critical conceptual flaw. A common misconception was that post-war Europe would be ravaged by widespread plagues and epidemics. However, medical advances, such as the development of DDT powder, offered new solutions. The U.S. WWII Typhus Commission, established in 1942, demonstrated this potential by rapidly mastering the Naples typhus epidemic in late 1943. The miracle performed in Naples, as hailed by the New York Times, showed that modern science and coordinated action could prevent the worst health crises. Despite UNRWA's noble intentions, its structure harbored inherent weaknesses. Its initial budget of $2 billion with the USI, providing $1.35 billion, proved inadequate. The requirement that 90% of a country's contribution be spent inside that country meant UNRWA spent 67% of its overall budget in the United States, limiting its operational flexibility. Herbert Lehman, UNRWA's first Director General, a former governor of New York, was described as a very nice, comfortable man, like a brown bear, but also as an indifferent organizer and not a very good fighter. These internal and external pressures significantly constrained UNRWA's scope. By the second half of 1944, as the war dragged on, it became clear UNRWA's budget of PS $450 million was not even half of what it actually needed. As the Allies penetrated into Germany in late 1944 and early 1944, the scale of the humanitarian disaster became clear. The advance, coupled with the German counteroffensive in the Ardennes, created a chaotic situation where millions of displaced persons were suddenly exposed. The liberation of concentration camps such as Ohrdruf, Bergen-Belsen, and Dachau served as undeniable evidence of Nazi atrocities. At Ohrdruf, 3,000 rotting, unburied bodies and 2,000 slave laborers near death were discovered. At Bergen-Belsen, approximately 14,000 people died even after British liberation. The initial Allied intelligence had a partial, fragmented, and often misleading understanding of the final solution. They often viewed inmates as a labor reserve rather than victims of systematic extermination. This unpreparedness meant that Allied military and administrative capabilities were utterly overwhelmed. For example, in Frankfurt, 21 military government officers attempted to care for 40,000 DPs. Lieutenant Marcus J. Smith, a young U.S. J. Smith, a young U.S. PA. Army doctor, recalled the improvisational nature of their work and the critical lack of medical supplies. The years of Nazi enslavement and dehumanization created deep psychological scars, what some observers termed a liberation complex. Polish social worker Marta Korwin observed a complex mix of revenge, hunger, and disorientation. The immediate aftermath was a humanitarian crisis requiring immense logistical and emotional resources. One of the most morally complex chapters of the post-war period was the forced repatriation of millions of displaced persons, particularly Soviet citizens. This was driven by Allied strategic interests and a desire to rebuild Europe, often at the cost of individual autonomy and human dignity. The post-war geopolitical realities, especially the division of Europe into spheres of influence, created immense pressure to repatriate populations. Allied strategic imperatives, such as the need for Soviet cooperation in dealing with defeated Germany and returning Allied prisoners of war, directly influenced decisions to comply with Soviet demands. This often meant handing individuals over to potential persecution. The vague wording of agreements like the Yalta Conference in February 1945, regarding the definition of Soviet citizen, allowed for differing interpretations. This justified forced repatriation based on Soviet territorial claims from 1939. By July 1944, the British War Cabinet had decided that Russian prisoners would be returned if the Soviet government wished. This set a precedent. Field Marshal Harold Alexander's Clear the Decks order on May 16, 1945, to make way for potential military action against Tito's Yugoslavia, highlighted the desperate logistical and political pressures driving repatriation decisions. The violent scenes of Cossack resistance to forced repatriation in Austria, on June 1, 1945, exposed the brutal reality of these operations. Thousands resisted, resulting in a pyramid of hysterical, screaming human beings. Anthony Crossland, a future foreign residing Bayat, described these events as the most nauseating and cold-blooded act of war. Ultimately, over 5.2 million Soviet nationals were repatriated from Germany, Austria, and other countries. The fate of individuals who had collaborated with the Germans for survival challenged simplistic notions of war guilt. Many were coerced into service due to brutal treatment and starvation, making their choices about survival rather than genuine allegiance. This was particularly true for Ukrainians. Ukraine had been decimated, 1 in 6 of its population killed. Young men were conscripted into the Red Army, while others formed nationalist guerrilla groups. Primo Levi observed returning Ukrainian girls in roofless cattle trucks, displaying animal-like humiliation and resignation. Many Ukrainians and Poles who had experienced Nazi occupation or fled the Soviets feared severe retribution upon forced repatriation. In June 1945, at Augsburg DP camp, escalating violence and panic erupted among Ukrainian DPs. Due to fears of forced repatriation, Ukrainians fabricated identity documents, using cut potatoes or war eggs for authorization stamps. They sent appeals to Allied leaders, including Your Excellency Mr. Eisenhower, to stop the brutality. The brutality of these forced repatriations began to erode Allied willingness to comply with Soviet demands. Driven by growing public and political pressure, General Eisenhower issued a temporary ban on the use of force in repatriations on September 4, 1945. By December 1945, repatriation became purely voluntary in the American zone, a policy soon adopted by other Western zones. For Polish DPs, numbering an estimated 1 million, the initial enthusiasm to return home waned with prolonged uncertainty and perceived Allied indifference. The psychological moment was lost, leaving hundreds of thousands of Poles reluctant to return to a Soviet-dominated homeland. Amidst this broader displacement crisis, the Jewish displaced persons carried a unique burden. They were not merely displaced, they were the Shereth Haplata, the surviving remnant of a genocide. The April 27, 1945, U.S.-Jew Air Force attack on a train of sick Jewish prisoners near Schwabhausen, and their subsequent escape and deliberation highlighted the immediate dangers and existential questions faced by Holocaust survivors at war's end. Approximately 200,000 Jews emerged alive from Nazi concentration campers. Well over 20,000 of these died within a week of liberation, physical and mental wrecks succumbing to their ordeal. Some liberators, confronted with the emaciated survivors, reacted with revulsion. General George S. Patton, in his diary, described Jews as lower than animals, revealing deep-seated anti-Semitism among some Allied leadership. The U.S. Army's initial policies, influenced by anti-Jewish sentiment and a focus on repatriation, created significant obstacles. Survivors faced indifference and bureaucratic hurdles, forcing them to rely on their own meager resources. In the winter of 1944 to 1944, Dr. Zalman Grinberg, a Lithuanian Jewish physician from Kovno, was approached by Michael Burstein, who envisioned rebuilding Jewish life. They established underground associations within Kaufring, a subcamp of Dachau. After liberation, Dr. Grinberg, using his professional authority and deception, secured medical aid and established a temporary hospital at the Benedictine monastery of St. Brake, Ottilion. Here, on May 27, 1945, a concert was held to mark the anniversary of liberation, with the Zionist anthem Hatikva sung. This act of self-organization was vital. Rabbi Abraham Klausner, a young U.S. Contuze Agate Army rabbi, went AWOL to dedicate himself to identifying survivors, reuniting families, and organizing efforts in DP camps. Army's control over mail services thwarted survivors' attempts to contact relatives, so Klausner produced his own lists of names. By late June 1945, the first Congress of Jewish Survivors in Germany convened at St. Time Tabir, Ottilion. Joseph Rosensaft, a charismatic and militant leader, emerged as a dominant voice on the Central Committee of Liberated Jews. He fiercely advocated for survivor rights and Jewish self-administration, even telling the Joint Distribution Committee, If you can't give us things, give us Yiddish typewriters, so we can criticize the joint to the Jews of the world. This self-organization and assertion of identity was crucial. In August 1945, President Truman, moved by reports from Henry Morgenthau, sent law professor Earl G. Harrison to investigate conditions of Jewish DPs. Harrison's report vividly exposed the dire conditions. Camps were crowded, frequently unsanitary, and generally grim, with complete idleness and no legitimate outside communication. Harrison's core argument was profound. Jews were a nation, and required recognition of their status as Jews, challenging their treatment as nationals of former persecutor countries. He unequivocally stated, "As matters now stand, we appear to be treating the Jews as the Nazis treated them, except that we do not exterminate them." Truman's reaction was visceral. The report made him sick. Desperate, he directed Eisenhower to appoint an advisor for Jewish affairs and initiate a policy of separate Jewish camps. This was a de facto recognition of their unique status. Truman's decision was also shaped by political calculation. I have to answer to hundreds of thousands who are anxious for the success of Zionism. I do not have hundreds of thousands of Arabs in my constituents. The long shadow of the Balfour Declaration from November 2, 1917 now loomed large. This British statement, promising a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, was driven by wartime strategic interests and Zionist lobbying. Chaim Weizmann, the key Zionist figure, had tirelessly championed the cause. But Palestine was already home to Arabs, who made up 9/10 of its population. British policy, especially the 1939 White Paper, had later restricted Jewish immigration due to impending war and the need for Arab friendship. Post-war, Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin accepted officials' advice not to reverse this policy, creating immense tension around Jewish immigration to Palestine. In parallel to the plight of Jewish DPs, another humanitarian catastrophe unfolded, the mass expulsion of millions of ethnic Germans from Easterns, and other humanitarian catastrophe unfolded. By April 1945, some 3.5 million refugees had already fled. The Allied powers, particularly Poland and Czechoslovakia, enacted policies of ethnic expulsion, driven by a desire for revenge and to solidify territorial gains. Churchill and Stalin gave robust support to these expulsions. Churchill stated on December 15, 1944, that expulsion is the method the most satisfactory and lasting. Millions arrived in Berlin, up to 25,000 a day by foot. Conditions were horrifying, emaciated, with dark rings under her eyes, and cattle trucks filled with dying women. This was a tragedy of the greatest magnitude. Betana Kientop's journey, packing in half an hour, her handcart searched multiple times, suffering thirst, dysentery, and flies from corpses epitomized this suffering. Estimates of deaths from these expulsions range from 200,000 to 2.3 million. Berlin itself was ruined, paralyzed, and unfed, with failing infrastructure. The British, upon arrival, were almost unprepared for this scale of German refugees. Initial Allied punitive policies, fueled by lingering anti-German sentiment, created a slow, bureaucratic response. Some officials believed Germans deserved to suffer for the war. The British economic crisis severely limited their capacity and willingness to fund extensive relief efforts. However, the mounting evidence of disease outbreaks, such as the 12,740 cases of typhoid in the British shown between July 1945 and January 1946, with 1,600 fatalities, began to shift policy. Military governors like Field Marshal Montgomery sent urgent warnings about impending famine and social unrest. These pragmatic concerns, rather than purely humanitarian ones, for self-preservation and geopolitical stability, compelled London to reconsider. The aftermath of World War II thus laid the foundations for the United Nations and its affiliated organizations, designed to address global crises. It led to transformations in U.S. immigration policy, opening doors to displaced populations, and the ending of homogeneous Anglo-Saxon societies in countries like Britain, Canada, and Australia. The plight and lobbying of Jewish DPs significantly influenced the creation of the State of Israel in 1948. The war and its aftermath also surfaced long-buried ethnic conflicts and nationalisms in Eastern Europe, which hold contemporary relevance. For decades, the narrative of post-war relief was often presented as a straightforward, heroic endeavor. However, newly examined records reveal a far more complex truth. A deeply human struggle marked by moral compromises, unforeseen challenges, and profound, lasting consequences. It was a time when the world grappled with the limits of its compassion and the true cost of liberation. The cost was measured not just in lives lost to combat, but in the prolonged suffering that followed. As the euphoria of victory waned, a different kind of war began to rage. Disease, ancient and brutal, stalked the continent once more. In August 1945, a devastating typhoid epidemic broke out. It raged for 3 agonizing months, claiming countless lives. Containing such outbreaks was a monumental task. The arrival of *DDT powder was a critical intervention against typhus, but often the supplies came too late, or in insufficient quantities. A more systematic approach was desperately needed. The *ration card system, already a tool for survival, was repurposed. It facilitated compulsory immunization checks for typhoid, a desperate measure to halt the tide of infection. The scale of this human suffering could not remain hidden. By autumn 1945, the press and relief organizations began a relentless campaign. Filmmakers like Humphrey Jennings captured the bleak reality in A Defeated People. On September 8, 1945, Picture Post published a searing article. It exposed the truly unsupportable situation in the camps. The public was forced to confront uncomfortable truths. The Daily Mirror posed a challenging question on October 5, 1945. Its editorial, "Feed the Brutes," sparked fierce debate. Was compassion a luxury or a necessity? Beyond disease, hunger gnawed at the very fabric of existence. In November 1945, a deputy military governor issued a grave warning. He underscored the gravity of the food situation. Millions faced starvation, even after the war's end. Operation Barleycorn emerged as a desperate, ingenious scheme. It aimed to release prisoners of war. Their task, to assist with agricultural labor, a stark testament to the collapse of normal infrastructure. This immediate crisis also put pressure on international bodies. By autumn 1945, UNRWA began to be tasked with camp improvements, a recognition that the military could not manage this colossal humanitarian effort alone. But the challenges extended far beyond the camps. Britain, a victorious nation, faced its own severe economic strain. The US loan agreement, finalized with Britain on December 6, 1945, was a vital lifeline. Yet, the scarcity continued, even for those at home. July 1946 saw Britain introduce bread rationing, a chilling reminder of the war's enduring impact on everyone.